Experimental filmmaker András Jeles'S name is associated with a radical stance that has never accepted any compromise with spectator-friendly commercial cinema. His entire oeuvre is marked by an obstinate resistance to creating film-like films based on the concept elaborated already in the 70s and summed up in his famous writing, Theory and Action, published in 1976. To which Jeles'S has remained faithful ever since. That in the course of its history, film has been exposed to the terror of fiction that has contaminated even the purest forms of documentary. This has led, in his view, to a misinterpreted opposition between documentary and fiction, since essentially every fiction is to some extent documentary, inspired by the cinematography of life, and vice versa, there is no documentary without the traces of fiction. His theoretical proposition is thus to get rid of this binary dichotomy, which he regards as the great fallacy of film history, by going against film-likeness, that is, by avoiding the traps set up by the generic and narrative conventions, and simultaneously by approaching film to the other arts. Jeles'S films profoundly reflect his distrust in the power of narrative. He rejects the clichés and conventions of classical film narration and considers that the true dimension of visuality lies in what arrests rather than makes smooth the flow of narration. He strives to confront the film medium with the conventional means of storytelling, regarding that film is most capable of expressing its own mediality if distanced from the ideological sediments inherent in narrative cinema. His view of the magical film harks back to the theoretical foundations of the Hungarian neo-avant-garde, laid among others by Miklós-Erdély and Gábor Bódi. Jeles sets magical film against narrative film, implying a more primeval manifestation of the moving image in the sense Tom Gunning defines the early cinema of attractions, a cinema, quote, that displays its visibility, willing to rupture a self-enclosed fictional world for a chance to solicit the attention of the spectator, unquote. For Jeles, magical film and narrative film are synchronous categories that divide the filmmaking practice. While narrative film is some sort of mapping of the world, temporally structured by narrated time, montage and sequence, magical film creates worlds anew. In them there manifests the atemporality and undivided unity of representation. While the former is interested in the story, the latter relies on the autonomy of the image. Pure magic is evidently film's unattainable ideal, as some degree of storytelling is unavoidable. In this case, film must at least reflect on narration, displace it from the usual track, and offer the spectator an unsettling experience. In Jeles'S concept, the true challenge of magical film is to render the unspeakable, to display the invisible. Thus, the attraction of the film lies in the mystery coded in the conjoined presence of the filmic materiality and the metaphysical purport beyond, the dialectics of presence and absence that is present in the other arts, most eminently in the art of painting. He formulates the apparent paradox that a particular medium can best express its own mediality via another medium, the foreign material of the other arts. Quote, there seems to be a peculiar tendency in art to create forms which display the most profound, the most mysterious features of the material, which show the power and the message of the elements lying within. It is a shocking paradox. If the form makes visible its own material, if the medium reveals its most private qualities, then it almost steps out of the circle of its own possibilities and gets close to a foreign territory, to the language of another art, unquote. This conceptual orientation of Jeles'S filmmaking practice also emerges in his latest experimental feature film, Sinister Shadow, made in 2017, in which Jeles'S poses yet another challenge to narrative cinema by deconstructing narration and synchronously by stepping onto the field of the other arts. The scenes of Sinister Shadow are woven onto a fragmentary, episodic narrative which loosely unfolds along two interconnected threads. The main thread is linked to the figure of the protagonist, Jan, an autistic figure endowed with a paranormal capacity of insight into the human body, sensitivity with which he assists her mother's medical practice. He hangs about among people who express their lack of awareness in a series of grotesque and surreal scenes that add up to a visionary anthropological survey of humanity. Jan is a contemporary embodiment of Dostoevsky's Holy Idiot, from whose perspective the vanities and vices of contemporary society are revealed. The other thread of the narrative is related to the other protagonist, Jan's father, Peter, an artist engaged with failing health in restoring Hans Holbein the Younger's The Ambassadors. The restoration work is a pretext for the film to include lengthy discussions between Peter and his doctor on the mystery of anamorphosis in Holbein's painting, pertaining to the disproportionate representation of the skull in the fore, which regains its normal shape only if viewed from a particular angle, and to the small crucifix of Christ, hardly visible behind the thick green curtain in the left-hand corner of the painting, but geometrically connected to the viewing angle necessary for the right vision of the skull. The title Sinister Shadow refers to the Latin umbra versa on the sundial from the painting, literally reverse shadow, that falls in the wrong direction as a proof of divine presence at crucifixion. The film epitomizes Jeles'S obsession with this canonical painting and with the cinematic implications of its interpretations. The figuration of anamorphosis stays at the heart of Western art. The art historical discourse around anamorphosis spans from the Renaissance studies of perspective through the fascination of the avant-garde, Dali, Duchamp, for techniques of distortion, to the preoccupation with anamorphic representation in the theory and practice of contemporary art. Anamorphosis is a form of representation that displays a distorted image if viewed from a central perspective. If viewed from a changed, oblique perspective, or with the meditation of a lens or mirror, the image regains its correct, undistorted dimensions, which comes as a revelation, an additional layer of meaning to the interpretation of the respective artwork. In a classical definition taken from Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopedia, anamorphosis is, quote, the projection of an unnatural image or a distorted representation of an image which is made on a plane and which nevertheless, seen from a certain viewing point, appears normal and executed with the correct proportions, unquote. Anamorphosis is thus originally a painterly figuration meant to challenge the boundaries of classical representation related to distortion, disruption, to the dynamics of perspective change, and to the revelation of hidden meanings. In the 1991 animated short film entitled Anamorphosis, or the Artificialis Perspectiva by the Quay brothers, anamorphosis is presented, quote, as a most powerful device for controlling understanding. It may be used whimsically to amuse, or else it can provoke and instruct. An image grasped too quickly might not leave a lasting impression. To lead the eye slowly through incomprehension and then offer a resolution, that is insight. If anamorphosis is the art of delaying access to deeper meaning, then we must learn to wait for a revelation, unquote. In Hans Holbein the Younger's The Ambassadors, at first sight, there turn up the well-to-do, self-confident figures surrounded by objects indicating sciences and other earthly preoccupations, while the figuration in the foreground appears as an incomprehensible stain. It is only at a second glance, from an oblique angle, that the stain gets reshaped and gains its contours as a skull, indicating that all that has been visible in the painting is just a matter of vanity from the perspective of death. The mystery of anamorphosis has placed Holbein's painting at the crossroads of interpreting orientations, from optical sciences to psychoanalysis and beyond. In Lacan's approach, the perception of anamorphosis reverts the focus to the gaze. Anamorphosis is not a visible object, but rather a gap within the look, which activates the phenomenology of desire. Lacan interprets the anamorphosis in Holbein's The Ambassadors as a trap for the gaze that triggers the observer's self-awareness. Anamorphosis activates an interpretive urge, quote, "It is the element that, when viewed straightforwardly, remains a meaningless stain, but which, as soon as we look at the picture from a precisely determined lateral perspective, all of a sudden acquires well-known contours, rendering all its constituents suspicious, and thus opens up the abyss of the search for a meaning. Nothing is what it seems to be, everything is to be interpreted, everything is supposed to possess some supplementary meaning," unquote. In Tony Meyer's interpretation of Slavoj Žižek, quote, "An anamorphosis is only the materialization of a surplus knowledge. The stain of the skull in The Ambassadors, for example, merely gives body to the knowledge that death is always the conclusion awaiting humankind, however clever we may be. Anamorphosis is therefore a form of suspense. It suspends the ostensive meaning of a picture or situation," unquote. Jeles'S carries out an intermedial cross-cutting by transposing the painterly figuration to the medium of film, probing thus the boundary of the cinematic. The integration of the painting, The Ambassadors, together with its interpretive aura within the body of the film, would not yet guarantee in itself the intermedial conjunction, since the condition of an intermedial relation in film, sensu stricto, is, in Joachim Pech's words, quote, "that the medial representation, performance, fundamentally determines the aesthetic perception of a film," unquote. Instead, in the film Sinister Shadow, Jeles'S creates an anamorphic narrative in which this painterly figuration gains an overarching signification pertaining to the cinematic medium and intended to effect a surplus potential that film is capable of only through the other arts. Intermediality, conceived by Pech as a, quote, "dynamic interdependence and changing complex of media forms," unquote, is performed by the anamorphosis standing not merely, and now I quote Agnes Pető, not merely as an inscription of one medium into another, but a more complex transfiguration, in the process of which one medium gets to be transposed as a figure into another, a figure of in-betweenness that reflects on both the media involved in this intermediate process," unquote. Jeles'S translates his vision of the humanity into an anamorphic way of storytelling, creating an askew perspective from which the history of mankind turns up as a surreal stage of the grotesque and the macabre. Sinister Shadow foregrounds not a technical but a conceptual anamorphosis that is meant to govern the reception of the film as formulated by the Quay brothers, quote, "to lead the eye slowly through incomprehension and then offer a resolution," unquote. Actually, the magic of film, in Jeles'S view, is consubstantial with the magic of anamorphosis. Jeles has always worked with forging cinematic meanings in the spirit of anamorphosis. He has always been preoccupied with displacing narratives, creating oblique perspectives, and readjusting the viewing angle upon canonical works, such as the Bible in his Joseph and His Brothers, or Madacs's The Tragedy of Man in his The Annunciation, in an intended revelatory way. Thus, Sinister Shadow is intrinsically linked to Jeles'S prior works and explicitly reflects on the concept that lies behind his entire experimental visionary film art. The question is, however, whether this latest synthesizing work lives up to the expectation raised by Jeles'S former films, whether the anamorphic subversion is carried out with precision enough for revelation. Sinister Shadow systematically builds up a distorted vision in order to reveal another perspective, in order to perform the visual rupture to show the visible within the invisible. An anamorphosis, then, is a point of view. It frames reality, Tony Myers writes in connection again with Zizek's views on fantasy. The most powerful device of reframing reality in Sinister Shadow is masking the image and placing it into a spatial framework. The effect is multiple. The spatial view creates distance and introduces a non-Euclidean perspective that relativizes the weight of earthly things. It creates an unsettling perspective from which the familiar seems strange, and vice versa, from which matters and figures become ghostly, uncanny. As the Béla Hamvas quotation chosen as the film's motto says, "Everything here is ghostly," in other words, everything is real. The anamorphic displaced spatial perspective reverts focus back to the gaze, implying God's gaze, a gaze that is impassive, which, as Jan says, I quote from the film, "God obviously doesn't understand what's happening here. He simply can't comprehend it," unquote. This overarching divine incomprehension frames the instances of unawareness through which existence is represented. The spectator is implicitly conferred this divine point of view. The spectator is faced, just as God is also faced in the film, with the imperative of ethical responsibility, or with the lack of it, if the gaze chooses to passively contemplate instead of taking action. The ultimate unspeakable, the message of the skull in Holbein's painting, is death. What God passively contemplates in Sinister Shadow is child death. The cosmic view frames, relativizes, and also makes even different textures of moving images. The collage effect is reinforced by the inclusion of documentary footage on the recent Aleppo massacre with images of wounded and dead children. The film shows the ultimate unspeakable. The scandal of Auschwitz hasn't come to an end, as Jeles'S writes. Auschwitz has always existed and it will never cease to exist, he says in an essay. At this time, images of war turn up on Jan's tablet in a distinct medial framework. At other times, no medial distinction is made. Fiction and documentary become each other's extensions, creating tension between their different ontologies, temporalities, and spatialities. The visual collage is complemented with a perhaps even more poignant sound collage, mixing ambient sounds, musical fragments, treated as debris of human culture, and untranslated soundtrack of war images, intensifying the effect of the uncanny. There is a permanently sustained contrast between the cosmic framework and the framed images, also in the sense that the framework is mobile, allowing the contemplation of action on a different scale, whereas the scenes of the supposedly diegetic level, especially the ones displaying Yan, are but a series of tableaux, installations, non-diegetical instances, often including static bodies, arrested or repetitive motions, stylized, theatrical, painterly, and even sculpturesque compositions, painterly qualities such as the grisaille, serving to maintain the anamorphic perspective, a continuous rupture in the film's medial perception. The discursive is thus systematically overwritten by the figural. Diegesis is fragmentary, consisting of singular, autonomous image compositions occupying distinct positions on the scale in between the unwatchable and the visually pleasurable. The cosmic frame has an aestheticizing effect, implying clarity and reinforcing the imageness of the framed spectacle. Jeles'S visual language is excessive and at times mannerish and over-stylized. See, for instance, the stylized representations of the cross, such as the crucified fox. All these sequences are necessary for creating the desired perspective, urging the spectator to look awry, to ultimately see the anamorphic stain in perfect shape in the end. As a conclusion, Sinister Shadow is a thought-provoking experiment with anamorphosis and offers a possible extension of the film medium in search for the proper perspective. Thank you very much.